Welcome back to the channel. Today we are reacting to the book Turning 15 on the Road to Freedom, written by Lynda Blackmon Lowery. If this book piques your interest, there will be a link in the description box below. Also, please check out my second YouTube channel titled See My Power is the men's version to this channel. Help me grow this channel by getting this video to 1,000 likes. And as always, don't forget to like, share, watch more videos, and subscribe to the channel.
Look up this.
Give us the ballot. To tell you the truth, I just felt that once our parents got the right to vote, everything would be a whole lot better. There's power in a vote. For years, Black people tried to register to vote, but they were mostly turned away. Just for trying to register, they could lose their jobs. You see, whenever a Black person tried to register, someone would take a picture and then show it to that person's boss. White people could fire Black people whenever and however they wanted. That's why the civil rights leaders needed us children to march. After Dr. King's speech, our local leaders planned 2 or 3 marches for us every day. They would say, "We're going to march to the courthouse tomorrow. If you're with us, come here to Brown Chapel at 9:30. The very first time I heard that, I said, "I'm going to march." On the day of a march, you would go to school for attendance, then slip out and make it down to Brown Chapel. Our teachers were the ones who unlocked the back door and let us out of school. They supported us. They had our backs. Our teachers were excellent, but these smart people could not vote. They couldn't pass the voter registration test. The tests were written to keep Black people from voting. White people didn't usually take those tests at all. The registrars asked ridiculous questions such as, how deep is the Alabama River? And how many jelly beans are in this gallon jar? The questions had nothing to do with voting or the Constitution or citizenship. 2 or 3 times a day, a group of us students would leave Brown Chapel heading downtown. I don't think we were ever fewer than about 50 kids on a march. Before we left, the adults would tell us, "You're going to go to jail. Do not fight back. You might be pushed, you might be hit. Just turn the other cheek. Do not fight back. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of you." Most of the time, once we got downtown, the police let us march for 4 or 5 blocks. Then they would march us right onto yellow school buses. If you didn't get on the bus fast enough, the police would shock you with a cattle prod. That's a stick with an electrical charge. Sort of like a taser is now. Farmers use them to push cattle to move quicker or to get out of the way. That's what they used on us. Like we were cattle. At first, they would take us to the old National Guard Armory, where we had to stand for hours all packed together or sit on the concrete floor. But after a week or so of that, they started taking us right to jail. Chapter 3. Jailbirds. The first time I went to jail, I was 14, and I was scared. I didn't know what they were going to do with us. There must have been about 100 boys and girls that time. All us girls were packed into one cell meant for 2 people. There were 2 iron beds coming out from the wall, and they didn't have mattresses on them, so they'd be really uncomfortable for the prisoners. Over in one corner was a sink, and there was a toilet. Just a toilet bowl. There was no way to shield yourself from whoever was walking down past the cells, so we shielded each other. After that first time, I wasn't so afraid, because I was with my buddies and we knew we had each other's back. What we could do with each other's backs, I don't know. Those white policemen had billy clubs and guns, but we held on to each other, and we figured there was safety in numbers. It helped when we sang, "We Shall Overcome." Singing those words made us believe we could do it. We could overcome the hate and racism. Every time I sang the line, "We are not afraid," I lied a little, but it was important to sing it. The people who weren't afraid sang it the strongest and the loudest. The sound of their voices was like a warm blanket on a cold night. It made me feel a little stronger and more protected. Then I could sing a little louder too. We sang it to let everyone know we were on our way, we would not be ignored, and we would not be stopped. Everything about the marches was well organized. The night before, the leaders would say, "We're going to have 3 demonstrations tomorrow. We'll need the first 75 kids here to go out by 9:30. Second march, we're going to send y'all out about 12:15. Third march, y'all are going to leave about 3 o'clock. We all knew ahead of time when there were going to be marches, so we could pick the march we wanted to go on. We learned the drill real quick. We went to jail, we came back out, and then we went to jail again, be it that same day or the next day. Pretty soon, we knew to take our own little bologna sandwiches and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and cheese sandwiches and cookies and all the penny candy we could get because jail food just wasn't good. If one of our parents or grandparents worked as someone's maid, they were bringing the white people's food home and giving it to us to take to jail with us. The white people never knew how much they had helped us. My father didn't work in a white home. He drove his own cab. He went and bought bologna so I would have those sandwiches to take to jail too. He was there for me. He wanted me to be safe. He told me, if you see yourself in a situation where you will get hurt, come back home. He just told me to be careful. Be real careful. With all the marching and going to jail, we kids were missing a lot of school. But we planned for that too. While we were marching, some kids stayed in school. They were the ones we called the brains. And the brains actually did homework for the rest of us. They took tests for us too. This was their way of taking part even if they weren't marching. Say I left to march, but there was a math test that day. Beatrice Torrey would stay at school and take my test, her test, and somebody else's test. Then during school lunch period, Beatrice would leave for the next march. We had it all figured out, and we were very determined. Once, when the city jail was full, the police took about 3 busloads of us kids to a prison camp called Camp Selma. This prison was about 5 miles away from town. After about 3 days there, they took us to another prison camp, even farther away. It was late at night, and you couldn't see much. So at first, we thought they were taking us home, back to Selma. But pretty soon, we knew we'd been riding too long to be going back home. I was scared, and I think everybody on all 3 buses was scared. We were sure our parents did not know where we were. They didn't know that we had been put at a state prison camp. We were gone for 6 long days. Finally, when our leaders in Selma found out where we were, they demanded our release. The buses brought us back to Selma, and we all ran home as fast as we could. We needed baths and something to eat besides black-eyed peas. That was the longest time I was ever in jail. Chapter 4. In the Sweatbox. For weeks, we marched and we went to jail, over and over again. Then the police shot Jimmy Lee Jackson in a nearby town. I didn't know Jimmy Lee, but when I heard the news, I was scared for him and for us all. Jimmy Lee had been peacefully marching in Marion, 30 miles away. The marchers were singing freedom songs when the state troopers and police attacked them. As Jimmy Lee tried to protect his mother, a state trooper shot him in the stomach. Marion was a real small town, so Jimmy Lee Jackson was brought to Selma. When we heard this, a lot of us headed for the Good Samaritan Hospital. That was the hospital for black people then. adults to march along with us kids in protest of Jackson's murder. It would be a whole new kind of march, a big march with everybody, adults along with us kids, on Sunday, March 7th. Chapter 5, Bloody Sunday. When the day came, we set out from Brown Chapel as usual. I was with Jimmy Webb and 15 of my buddies. Jimmy was our group leader. He told us to stick together and to remember, steady, loving confrontation. When we got to the top of the Edmund Pettus Bridge going out of town, all I could see was a sea of white people. That's when I got nervous. The road was full of white men on foot and on horseback. They were state troopers and sheriff's deputies. Along the road were white people sitting on their cars waving Confederate flags. The deputies were just mean white men. They didn't have uniforms or anything. Our sheriff deputized any white man who might want to bust our heads. The harder you hit, the more popular you were with him. And Sheriff Clark was the meanest of them all. He was a staunch segregationist. He believed that he was white and he was right and that was it. He hated black men, women, and us black kids. He just hated us all. At first, I tried to tell myself it would be okay because there were so many of us. Then I saw the state troopers putting on gas masks and I got really scared. I'd only seen a gas mask on TV, but somehow I knew something dangerous was happening. I had never been in a violent situation before. Sure, we'd been hit with a billy club or cattle prod, but we'd never really been beaten. Suddenly, this seemed like something very different. "Go back to your church," the troopers bellowed out on bullhorns. "Go home." Then Jimmy Webb said, "Let's pray." And we went down on our knees. That was normal. You marched, you were stopped, you prayed, then you turned around or went to jail. So I was on my knees when I heard these sounds. Pop, 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 pop. All of a sudden, a cloud of gas was burning my lungs and my eyes. I couldn't breathe and I couldn't see. It was terrifying. I didn't realize it then, but it was tear gas. The next thing I knew, I felt a man's hand grab me from behind, pulling me backward. I heard him say that hateful word. Then I bit that hand, and that's when he hit me over my eye. He hit me twice, hard. I was still kneeling, struggling to get up, when he pushed me forward and hit me again, this time on the back of my head. I staggered up and ran right into the tear gas, but that big white man kept on running after me and hitting me. People were screaming and hollering and yelling. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I must have fainted, because the next thing I knew, I came to on this stretcher. Some men were loading me into the back of a hearse, but I wasn't dead, and I sure wasn't going to let them put me in the back of that hearse before my time. People were still running back across the bridge. The police and the state troopers were still beating them, and their air was thick with tear gas. I jumped off the stretcher and started running toward home. I didn't know what I was doing. I just ran. When I got across the bridge, that's when I saw my little sister Joanne. She'd been marching farther back. Now she looked like she was dead, lying in a man's arms. I ran to him crying, "Oh, she's dead. They killed my sister." But he said she had just fainted. So I slapped her on the side of her face, to wake her up. But when Joanne opened her eyes and looked at me, she started screaming. I knew tear gas had messed up my face, but I didn't realize I was covered in blood. Troopers were everywhere, and I was sure one was going to hit me again. So I grabbed Joanne's hand, jerked her up, and started running. We ran straight to Brown Chapel. But there was a wall in front of the church. A wall of troopers and policemen and people on horseback. They weren't letting anyone in or out. So I just kept running with Joanne. I wasn't ready to stop till we got to the First Baptist Church. Lots of people were there who had been hurt. We were told to wash our faces, necks, hands, and arms, any part that had been exposed to the tear gas. Everyone was trying to help us. When one man saw Joanne and me, he said, This child is bleeding bad. She's got to go to the hospital. I didn't know who he was talking about because Joanne wasn't bleeding. Then someone put a towel to my forehead and said, "She's bleeding from the back of her head too." They took me to Good Samaritan Hospital, but there were white doctors there. And in my mind, it was not a good day to be around white people. When the doctor sewed up my forehead, I felt every stitch. There were 7 stitches over my eye and 28 in the back of my head. I didn't know it then, but while I was getting stitched up, people across the country were watching a special news report on TV. They saw what happened in Selma that day. The day reporters called.
I episode.
They tried to comfort me to ease my fear. They talked about the significance of what we were doing and how far we had come in the struggle, but I could not be comforted. To me, it was Bloody Sunday all over again. I was that scared. Then a white man named Jim Lethero came over. He had lost a leg in a war and was walking all the way to Montgomery on 2 crutches. Jim told me that before he'd let anyone else harm another hair on my head, he would lie down and die for me. I knew I couldn't let this man do more for me than I could do for myself. My grandmother used to say that if you give in to something, if you give someone or something control over you, then you've given up yourself. And you couldn't do that. So I couldn't let George Wallace or my fear from having been beaten take control of me. If I did that, I would never become the person I wanted to be. And the person I wanted to be was a person who would stand up against what was wrong. I wanted not only to protect myself, but to protect others. Not only to fight for myself, but to be out there fighting for others. So at that moment I knew, if this man was willing to die for me, then I really had to give up the fear of dying myself. I knew I had to do this, and I could do it. The march started 1 hour late that morning. But when it finally began, Jim Lethero and I marched and talked and sang freedom songs together down that highway. I wasn't quite over my terror, though. I kept looking around. Every sudden movement or sound made me jump, and there was a lot going on. People in cars drove by yelling out racial slurs. Guardsmen were searching the woods and swamps for snipers. Dogs sniffed under every little bridge for bombs. Helicopters were always over us. There was a lot to be afraid of. But I just kept what my grandmother told me in my mind. I knew I couldn't let fear of those white people take control of me. As we marched that day, we passed black people who lived along the way. They were on the sides of the road waving at us and yelling, "See you in Montgomery!" And there was a little old wooden school where the children and the teachers were out there waving at us. They were just waving and singing, "We shall overcome." That all felt nice. So we did have a good time. Singing the freedom songs helped. "We shall overcome" was once just a dream for the future. But we were changing that. And the songs helped us. They really did. Music is something that just stirs a person up. Back then, the songs were emotional tools. They set our minds on what we were doing and why we were doing it. Everybody has a favorite song. And mine was, woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. That was my song. We sang Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around at different points of the day too. And always, always, no matter what, we sang, We Shall Overcome to keep going. As I walked that day, I knew each step was getting me closer to George Wallace. I was still afraid, but I wasn't terrified anymore. I was afraid when people talked about someone bombing the bridges and stuff, but I wasn't terrified for myself. Determination had entered into it instead. Determination is a way of overcoming terror. So by the end of the second day, I felt fine. I was ready. That evening, we made it to our second campsite. People were tired, especially their feet. Most people had blisters, so we were all happy just to sit around. People talked and we sang more songs. Some of the men played cards. It was just a nice time. Mostly the ground was wet because it had drizzled rain all that day and the day before. But we went to sleep in those big tents again. Chapter 8. Weary and Wet. Tuesday, day 3, was the hard rain day. We were given these little orange ponchos to wear. Most of us had raincoats and umbrellas, but we wore the ponchos too. That day, we had to go through a dark, swampy area. As we walked, the National Guardsmen scouted ahead, checking the woods and the swamp for snipers. Their dogs searched for bombs, and helicopters stayed over us. You heard the helicopters every day and even at night during the march. They were looking for snipers too. People came enjoying the march during the day, and they'd go back home at night. At first, most of the people were from Selma or the countryside nearby. But as we got closer to Montgomery, people from there came enjoying the march. Those people in cars still drove past us and yelled negative things, the hateful stuff. But the National Guard kept the traffic flowing, so they couldn't stop. They had to keep going. After 2 days of drizzling rain and then a whole day of hard rain, the ground was really soaked. Our campsite that night was so muddy, someone put down hay and then a plastic tarp over the hay. But I sank down into the mud anyway, and I wasn't the only one. We all woke up muddy. We joked that it was the heavy people who sank down in that mud, but I weighed about 90 pounds and I got just as muddy as the heavy people. It was a good thing a family nearby let me bathe in their house. Chapter 9. Montgomery at last. On that fourth day of the march, thousands of people joined us as we got to the outskirts of Montgomery. There we stopped at the city of St. Jude, a Catholic center where people began to gather. It felt just awesome. I had done it. I had really done it. I was there. And then deep inside of me, all the fear that something might happen to me and the pain and anger that had driven me there was released. I fell down on the ground and just cried and cried and cried. I could not stop crying until I let it all out. And then it was gone. I was free. Pretty soon, even more people were pouring in from Selma, people who hadn't been allowed to make the whole march. It wasn't just us 300 marchers anymore. They say by that night, there were about 10,000 people in all. My sister Joanne came and lots of my friends. Daddy dropped them off and then went back to Selma to pick up more people. People were carpooling because it was hard to get gas. The white service station wouldn't sell gas to blacks during the march. Daddy bought gas from the only black service station in Selma. That night was amazing. All these famous singers and actors from Hollywood and New York City had come to Montgomery too. Harry Belafonte, Sammy Davis Jr., Pete Seeger, Tony Bennett, Nina Simone, Peter, Paul and Mary, and many more. There was this little stage set up so they could perform for the crowd. For us, there had never been anything like that show in Alabama before. The next morning, March 25th, I knew I was going to see George Wallace, and he was going to see me. Everything was different that day. There were even more people now, more than 25,000. My buddies were there, kids I went to jail with so many times. And Daddy was there too. We were all singing and happy, marching to the Capitol. We weren't walking two abreast anymore. Marchers filled the street. People had to squeeze in to join. There were so many of us, there wasn't room for people to stand on the sides and cheer us, but some people stood on the parked cars. When I got to the Capitol, I looked for Governor Wallace in the windows. They said he was behind the curtains peeping out, but I couldn't tell. I got as close as I could and shouted, "I'm here, Governor Wallace, I'm here!" So somebody in the governor's office surely got to see my bandages. Somebody did. There were lots of speakers, which made for a long, long day. Then it was over. What began on Bloody Sunday was done at last. I went home to Selma and back to school, but I was a different person. We still had mass meetings, but we didn't march or go to jail anymore. I learned a lot of things on that march, and one of them was about fear, how to respect it and how to embrace it. I also learned that I was not alone, that there were a lot of people, white as well as black, who really cared about what happened to me, Lynda Blackmon, and to the black people of Selma, Alabama. I had learned so much, I just had to think about it all for a while. And while I was thinking, something happened. On August 6th, 1965, the United States Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. We had won! My buddies and I, who had gone to jail so many times, had won. Everyone on that march to Montgomery won. We were determined to do something, and we did it. If you are determined, you can overcome your fears, and then you can change the world. The Selma movement was a kids' movement. We didn't know it at the time, but we were making history. You have a voice too, and with determination, you can be a history maker, just like me. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Ain't gonna let no. Voting rights? 100 years before Bloody Sunday, the United States fought the Civil War over the rights of 3,950,528 Americans. The question was this: were these enslaved men, women, and children people with rights guaranteed by the Constitution? Or were they property? More than 600,000 soldiers from North and South died to decide that question. The answer came when the United States Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, and the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed all the rights of citizenship. These rights had been denied us African Americans before. The right to marry, to own property, to be protected by law, to travel, to go to school, and to vote. Finally, the Constitution said we had these rights and more. But 100 years later, there I was, marching and going to jail for a right we had won so long ago. The right to vote. Why? In places like Selma, state laws and procedures made registering to vote easy for white people, but close to impossible for African Americans. First, you filled out a 4-page application. Then you took an extremely difficult literacy test, which white applicants usually did not have to take at all. And the registrars, who were all white, could decide that you'd failed, even if you knew all the answers. Finally, you had to find a person who was already registered to vouch for you. After that, you waited for days or weeks until the registrars decided, in their opinion, if you were fit to vote. And that was not all. Just for trying to register, your photograph was taken and shown to your employer and your landlord. You could be fired from your job and evicted from your home. And then your picture was circulated to all the other employees and landlords so you could not get a new job or rent another home. That's why my father could not vote. My grandmother could not vote. Even my teachers could not vote. In 1964, there were 14,400 white citizens and 15,115 black citizens eligible to vote in our country. More black than white citizens. But of the 9,530 people registered to vote, 9,195 were white. And that was after years of really brave people working to register African Americans. So it was white voters who elected Governor George Wallace. His slogan was, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. White citizens elected our mayor, Joe Smitherman, another segregationist, and they elected Sheriff Jim Clark, one of the meanest segregationists around. All of this is why, time after time, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. called out, "Give us the ballot," as he put it. So long as I do not possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. I cannot make up my mind. It is made up for me. I cannot live as a democratic citizen, observing the laws I have helped to enact. I can only submit to the edict of others. He called our all-white government democracy turned upside down. This is why I went to jail and marched for the right to vote. This is why I rejoiced when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And why, the day I turned 21, the voting age back then, I registered to vote. It was a great feeling, registering. But for me to have that feeling, many people had paid a high price. The voting rights movement started in Selma before I was even born. There was a group of people so brave they were called the Courageous Eight. One of them, Amelia Boynton, had this big sign in her office that said, "A voteless people is a hopeless people." And I believe that. I really do. It took tremendous determination to win the right to vote. You know how I was beaten and terrified? Many others were too. But 3 people lost their lives in the days before and after Bloody Sunday. They were murdered, and 1 friend disappeared. These are their stories. Jimmy Lee Jackson died on February 26, 1965. Remember Jimmy Lee Jackson, the man who died while we were in jail? He was the youngest deacon of his church, an Army veteran and determined to vote. He tried to register over and over again for 4 years. On the night of February 18th, he marched for that right and for freedom of speech. One of the movement's leaders was in jail for speaking out. With Jackson were his mother, his 82-year-old grandfather, and some 400 others, all unarmed. The marchers were nervous because it was nighttime and there were more police than usual. Both police and state troopers were there. Even Sheriff Jim Clark from Selma was there. They had guns, clubs, and those electric cattle prods ready. When the streetlights went out, they attacked, beating the men, women, youth, elders, even the press. Many people tried to run to the church for shelter, but they were blocked by more police. so they rushed into local homes or businesses, anywhere they could get away. Jimmy Lee Jackson ran into a little cafe. There he tried to shield his grandfather, who was badly beaten, and his mother from the police. But a trooper shot Jimmy Lee Jackson in the stomach. He tried to run, but the troopers followed and continued to beat him until he fell to the ground. He died 8 days later. Jimmy Lee Jackson was 26 years old and the father of a young daughter. Reverend James Reeb died on March 11, 1965. Reverend Reeb was a Unitarian minister from Boston, a white man who came to Selma the Monday night after Bloody Sunday. He was one of many who answered Martin Luther King's call for religious leaders to come and march for freedom the next day. On Tuesday, some 3,000 marchers followed King to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where I had been beaten just 2 days before. They knelt in front of the troopers who blocked their way, they prayed, and then they turned around. Afterward, Reverend Reeb and 2 others went to a small, black-owned cafe for dinner. When the 3 ministers left the cafe, a group of white men attacked and beat them with baseball bats and clubs. 2 days later, Reverend Reeb died from his injuries. He was 38 years old and the father of 4 young children. Viola Gregg Liozzo died on March 25, 1965. Viola Liozzo was a white homemaker who drove all the way from Detroit because she was so upset about what was happening in Selma. I got to know her because she stayed with the family right near us in the GWC houses. After the big march, Mrs. Liozzo drove back and forth between Montgomery and Selma to bring tired, happy marchers home. With her was someone I knew well, my neighbor, Leroy Moten. On one of the trips back to Montgomery, Miss Liozzo's car was forced off the road by a carload of men, KKK members. The men shot her in the head, killing her instantly. Viola Liozzo was 39 years old and the mother of 5 children. Leroy Moten disappeared on March 25, 1965. When the Klansmen shot Viola Liozzo, they thought they'd killed Leroy Moten as well, but he had lain down underneath her bleeding body and stayed so still that the murderers thought he was dead too. That's the only reason Leroy wasn't murdered. As soon as they could, people got Leroy out of Selma. They had to get him away from the Klansmen, who would have killed him for sure, because he was the only eyewitness to murder. Leroy Moten was 19 years old when he fled for his life, leaving his home, family, and friends behind. To this day, he lives safely far away from Selma. On August 6, 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, enforcing the voting rights that had been guaranteed in the 14th and 15th Amendments. The new law said that in parts of the country where the right to vote was withheld, the federal government would review state or local laws and prevent any that discriminated against voters. Since it was passed, the Voting Rights Act has been changed several times. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the part of the act that targeted places like Selma, where the right to vote was denied in the past. A majority of the justices said that discrimination was no longer a problem, so federal review was not needed. The justices who disagreed said the federal review prevented discrimination and that without it, voting rights would become a problem again. Who has the right to vote is still being decided today.
Let me be honest, you have to love a book that you can learn something from. A good historical book. Turning 15 on the Road to Freedom, written by Lynda Blackmon Lowery. I must say it's a well-written book. Tell me your thoughts about this book in the comments. What did you like? The parts that you didn't like? The things that you didn't know, but you are happy to have learned it. Also, do not forget to like the video, share the video, watch more videos, and subscribe to this channel.